And I think that's where people really get tripped up quite a bit, is like they're maybe approaching listening from an extractive standpoint. Actually, just to go back to what we were talking about before, they're trying to pull out the nuggets of information that will help prove their point or help give them the opportunity to ask that next question. What they're not really doing is trying to connect with people on like a fundamental and deep level. And I think, to me, it's like if you're going to spend an hour of your life with somebody, or if you're going to spend any amount of time with somebody, why would you want to do that in a half-assed way? Like, why would you want to do that in a way that has an agenda? It kind of defeats the entire purpose of connecting with people in the first place. You might as well just talk to yourself in the mirror or record yourself. So for me, like, listening is really about connecting. And connecting is really about vulnerability and being open to other people's experiences so that you can be more in accord with your own experience.
I think the younger Roger would have heard that with the idea of trying to figure out how to argue against that. Whereas maybe the more recent Roger is regretting the years I wasn't thinking that way. People talk about sometimes you listen when you're really just waiting to talk. I think I've spent a lot of time listening with the idea of coming up with, okay, how do I land my argument? And not, how do I connect with this person? Yeah. And I think there's some reasons for that. And in my past, and it's connected to an unmet need that I had that helped me find my superhero power, which is, I think, part of that's being expressed in these conversations, and why this podcast and becoming a coach and doing the work that I do in organizations is so fulfilling, because I'm getting to express and getting to attend to maybe that unmet need and filling it with, now connections is where it's at. That's where the good stuff is, and being present in that moment and not trying to convince people of something, but trying to understand where they're at. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could learn something about where you're at.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So much of this to me is arriving to what is. I got Ram Dass sitting here behind me. Mm-hmm. The whole idea is like, arriving to what's happening in the moment. Life is already happening. Like, there's nothing that we need to do, right, other than just be present and aware of what's actually occurring. And when you're talking about engaging with other people, I think the real gift and the opportunity of language and being able to express and being able to even hear and communicate in the ways that we are, it's a unique thing. Nothing else on the planet is able to do this. The gift there is being able to come together and arrive to what's actually happening, both for yourself and for the other person. And that, I think, is what then becomes what we call collective effervescence, right? It's like when you bring things together, the beauty and the magic that kind of bubbles up from that engagement and that interaction, that doesn't occur if you're arriving from a closed standpoint, or if you're coming from it with an agenda of some sort. You don't get that real generative experience with other people. And my guess is, and I hate to blame social media because everybody blames social media for everything, but my guess is so much of the world these days is about this transactional nature. I can just swipe to the next person. I can just go to the next video. Something new will be fed to me. And I think there's this expectation of immediacy, and there's this expectation of like, what am I getting from this situation? Which I think is antithetical to the way that we actually operate as human beings. We are by nature community-oriented and collaborative individuals. And if you can really think about like, well, what are the inherent qualities and nature that we can bring to the forefront when engaging with somebody else, well, then it becomes really much, I think, a simpler equation. If people are like, well, I don't know how to deal with this meeting, this difficult conversation that I have to show up to next. Well, if you can just show up with curiosity and with compassion and listen, it opens the doors to so much possibility that just simply would not be available otherwise.
So what or who inspired you to have the superhero power of the art of listening?
That's a good question. I mean, it's funny because when you threw this up in the emails before the call, I was trying to track back and think about like, well, where does this actually originate from? I think for me, it probably was born out of extreme social anxiety and discomfort growing up. I grew up in a pretty abusive environment. I was not like the other kids that I grew up with for multiple different reasons. And I never really quite felt like I fit in those environments that I was in. And now looking back on it, it's like it's pretty obvious what was going on and why those things were occurring. But I think what it created for me was a deep curiosity in human psychology and how people function and work, because I noticed that so many people around me kind of operated differently. Like my brain is wired differently than a lot of people. Like they call it neurodiversity these days. But back then, when I was in my teens, like there wasn't language around this. There was, ADD. Maybe they talked about that a little bit, but that was about the extent of it. So for me, I think it was born out of a need to try to better understand the world around me. So like listening became my default as opposed to like speaking. I was a little bit of a shy kid for the largest part of my childhood. And a lot of the time, what I actually spent doing was just listening and observing how other quote unquote normal people behaved so that I could mirror or mimic that so I could have a fighting chance of seemingly being normal.
Mm.
That led to early exposure to like things like documentary film. I remember when I was in middle school, like I shot my first documentary film. I can't remember what the actual event was, but it was on racism. And this was in central Pennsylvania. And I was interviewing kids in the library of our middle school talking about their experiences with race and othering. And I remember like having this, VHS tape deck camera and looking at people through the little viewfinder and having these conversations with folks and realizing that through powerful questions and by really holding space for somebody's story and narrative, it creates this sense of connection that you just don't get in normal everyday life. And I think for me, that was a bit of the aha moment. And ever since then, it was essentially like one thing after another leading me to opportunities to hold space and to cultivate listening. Um, After I was no longer quite as awkward and quite as introverted as I was when I was a kid, then it kind of turned into this other thing where, I could hold space for people that were dealing with a difficult traumatic event. I could have a business meeting with somebody and really deeply understand like what their pain points were and what they were trying to solve for, so that me as a consultant, I could kind of wedge myself in there and offer some sort of a solution. Later on now as a coach and as a facilitator for mindfulness, obviously it helps quite a bit. But yeah, I think it was born out of almost a deficit of a sense of belonging and connection with others. And it was cultivated as a way to try to learn how to be with others and be in community with others.
Thank you for sharing that. The streak of vulnerability is continued there in that story. So thank you for sharing that. And thinking about my own path and my own experience with not feeling worthy, I for me it was a different direction. Like I was trying to get attention, and so I would do things that would get me attention. Um, but that was probably because I was not getting the attention that I wanted. Whereas I could see in your situation, you might not want that attention that was going to be coming at you if
Yeah,
you've talked more than you listened. Yeah.
that's
Mm.
exactly right. Yeah, and
Thank
I
you.
learned early on that it was much safer to be quiet and to ask questions and to offer ideas or to offer suggestions. Now, obviously, as I got older, I realized that there's an immense amount of value in being able to express yourself fully and completely. But, from those early fundamental stages, I think that's really what cultivated that superpower that then kind of attached to this hypervigilance that was not great, but I think has also served me pretty well as I've gotten older. It was designed at that time to kind of keep me safe and always kind of looking out for warning signals or like gestures or different tells that somebody might have that might indicate danger or lack of safety, or to try to read between the lines of what somebody was saying, because a lot of times the messages that I was getting were quite mixed in my household. But as I got older, I was able to really utilize that and hone that and almost cultivate more of an intuition around like, well, what's the opportunity to ask the powerful question? What's the opportunity to like encourage somebody to share in a meaningful way to really get at the bottom of what's going on for somebody?
So, in case you were happen to be talking to someone who probably talked more than they listened, maybe named Roger, do you have a framework or a process that you follow when you're using your superhero power of the art of listening?
That's a good question. Probably, though, I think it's more intuitive at this point. I think it does go back to this idea of arriving with curiosity and compassion, both for myself and the other person. So much of what I'm doing, even in this call right now, not being self-aware in the sense of like, oh, let me be careful about what I say, or let me like be careful to frame this in just a certain way, but just even just noticing what's happening in my experience in the moment. So like as I'm sitting here right now, I notice that I'm actually feeling pretty relaxed. The heart rate isn't racing like it normally would be if I was trying to be a certain way. um, I feel like I've been able to cultivate this process of just grounding and arriving to what is first before then sharing or engaging with somebody else. For other people that maybe don't have that process, I think, at first, before you even get into the conversation, having an intention for how you want to be, not what you want to get out of that conversation necessarily, but how you want to be, I think is really important. I ran into this actually just yesterday. I had a very difficult conversation with a colleague, and I even started the conversation by saying, I have no agenda. I have not made a decision on anything. I'm arriving here with curiosity and compassion, and I just want to create a space where we can explore what comes next. And I think setting that intention, being really clear about, what is important and what would success look like in this experience together, I think is a great place for somebody to start. And even just speaking that out loud, I think can disarm somebody and can create a little bit more of a connection, because the person on the other end of that conversation is likely having an idea of like, well, what's this conversation going to be? Am I in trouble? Like, what's the repercussions that are going to happen after this conversation? So if you can arrive to that conversation with a sense of curiosity and compassion and vulnerability, it just allows everybody to kind of get on the same page a lot quicker. From there, I think I am always looking at the impulses that I have to try to fix or to solve or to offer wisdom of some sort. And I think through my coach training that I've done over the years, what I've learned is that holding space is way more valuable than asking questions or offering advice. And as a fully admitted man in America, like the way I was trained was to fix things. We're out there to try to solve problems. And I've learned from my wife and from other people in my life that really the more important thing is to allow people to be heard, not to try to fix their problems. So if you can start there of like, have I given somebody the space to be heard? Have I really truly heard what they're saying? And can I reflect that back to them in a way that resonates with them? That's going to go a lot farther than any bits of wisdom or any advice that you're going to be able to give somebody. So that would be another principle that I would really root on. And then I think the other piece to it, I think, is compassion, both for yourself and for other people. Like I say random stuff all the time that I wish I didn't say, and like offering myself compassion in that moment and understanding that, like, okay, there was probably something internally that wasn't really being addressed that drove me to say that thing. Or maybe I didn't pause long enough just to like gather my thoughts so that I can express myself and articulate myself in the way that I really would like to. I mean, that's easier said than done. That takes a lot of practice, and I think that itself is a superpower of just being able to pause, as Viktor Frankl is often misquoted as saying. It's that gap between stimulus and response is where we find our freedom. So really trying to expand that gap a little bit, not just for yourself but for other people, so that you can have the ability to be free in that moment, I think is like a really fundamental part of what I would consider to be a superpower around listening.